Coming up on Network Africa, they're not free yet, but it's certainly a step in the right direction. We have word that two of the Al Jazeera journalists, Mohamed Fahmy and Baher Mohamed, have received a presidential pardon. Then EU leaders meet in Brussels and are set to discuss a plan to relocate 120,000 migrants across the continent. And this decision doesn't go down well with some EU members. And later on, we have the latest from Burkina Faso now that we hear that normalcy has been restored barely a week after the coup. Hello and welcome to Network Africa on Channels Television with me, Cynthia Are. Today is a big day for not only journalists but those who've been supporting the Al Jazeera journalists. We are pleased to report that Egypt's president has pardoned two of Egypt's journalists, that's Baher Mohamed and Mohamed Fahmy, and they were convicted of broadcasting false news. A presidential spokesman says Mohamed Fahmy, a Canadian, and Baher Mohamed, an Egyptian, are on a list of 100 prisoners to be released later. State media also says a third person from the case, that's Peter Grester, who has also been pardoned, but it's not clear if this is the Australian Peter Grester that's been referred to, as he was deported in February of this year. All three were sentenced to 3 years in prison last month after a retrial, and prosecutors accused them of collaborating with the outlawed Muslim Brotherhood after the overthrow of President Mohamed Morsi by the military in 2013. The journalists denied the allegation and said they were simply reporting the news. We'll have more on that, but staying in Egypt, and this is not such good news. You will recall that the Egyptian security forces made a dreadful and costly mistake last week when 8 Mexicans were mistakenly killed after being mistaken for Islamists. Without surprise, the news did not go down well with Mexican authorities, and the foreign minister visited Cairo for explanations. We haven't heard much about what further explanations have been given to Mexico, but we can confirm that 8 bodies have been flown back to Mexico. The bodies will later be delivered to the families after forensic examination, and we understand that President Enrique Pena Nieto met in private with the families of the 8 victims and reiterated his condolences and said his government would offer support along with all the necessary consular, legal and administrative assistance during the returning of their deceased loved ones. Well, for more on these developments in Cairo and Mexico, we go live to Cairo, where the Voice of America's Edward Iranian is standing by. Edward, thank you very much for joining us.
Yes, Cynthia, thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. I'm going to start with the good news. How exactly did this presidential pardon come about for Mohamed Fahmy and Baher Mohamed?
Well, Cynthia, the pardon was sort of in the cards because President Sisi had indicated at an earlier stage that he was willing to pardon the journalists after the legal case was ended. The final legal procedure ended very recently. It is an Islamic holiday tomorrow, that is, the Eid, and traditionally pardons are given out to people who have either been wrongly convicted or whom the chief executive believes deserve to be pardoned. And that coincides with tomorrow. 100 people are being released. That is, the 2 journalists. I believe the third journalist was not pardoned, and a number of other activists whom are mostly young people, according to the Egyptian media. Some of the Muslim Brotherhood supporters, university students. And also the Egyptian media is mentioning that President Sisi is going to the United Nations for the annual September opening session of the UN General Assembly. So obviously he's going to be meeting with world leaders there and probably wants to sort of make his image shine a little bit.
Now, Edward, speaking of image, there is speculation that it's due to the bad press and bad image which Egypt has gained recently, especially with what happened last week concerning the Mexicans. I mean, we've looked at how things have played out this year, first of all with the conviction of the Al Jazeera journalist, and then the anti-terrorism law, and then that unfortunate incident where 8 Mexicans were killed. That basically started to, dent the relationship which Egypt had with countries like Canada and Mexico. So what's the speculations that we're hearing right now actually say that it's due to this bad rep and not necessarily tradition of Egypt releasing prisoners that actually triggered this action taken by the government.
Well, clearly that's part of the equation. I don't think Egypt would like to have bad relations with Western states, with major world powers. That's always been the case. Egypt relies very heavily on the goodwill of these nations for tourism dollars, yes. For other things like foreign aid, for humanitarian aid, for contracts in the field of domestic field, electricity contracts, oil contracts. So I don't think it's in anyone's interest to have bad relations with these countries. But I must say, watching the messages that go over on Twitter, it's very easy to tarnish the image of a country with messages and with tweets that are not necessarily true. I've seen just an incredible number of messages on Twitter that have not been true. Misinformation, disinformation, and not necessarily in these cases, but you have to deal with a social media sphere which is often putting out information which is erroneous. And I think countries are having trouble, not just Egypt, dealing with that phenomenon. And I've seen that just today watching Twitter, watching some of the things that some apparently ostensibly responsible people are putting out, and they're biased. They're not fair. They're sort of categoric denunciations of things which are a lot more nuanced than they're making them out to be.
Well, Edward, thank you. Just quickly, if you can, possibly in 30 seconds, do you have any further explanations as regards what the Egyptian government might have told Mexico concerning the tourists who were killed last week?
Yes, the Egyptian ambassador to Mexico indicated, according to the Egyptian press, that it was not clear that Egypt was responsible for the deaths of those Mexican citizens, tourists. I think pretty much everyone that's read the initial information that came out when the act happened came to the conclusion that Egypt was guilty. But there appears to be a media gag on the investigation, so there isn't a lot of information filtering out. And as I said before, the last time we spoke, I believe this is a financial issue, because once you admit guilt in something like this, you have to pay millions of dollars to the families. That's what happened when an Egyptian plane crashed over the Atlantic some years ago. Egypt was not declared guilty of that crash and did not have to pay millions of dollars to the families.
Edward, you've been fantastic. Thank you so much for giving us the latest. Thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure, Cynthia.
The Voice of America's Edward Iranian reporting from Cairo. Still to come on Network Africa. EU leaders meet in Brussels and they are set to discuss a plan to relocate 120,000 migrants across the continent.